If you don't ever try to change anything, by definition, you will not. I mean, the world isn't just going to change.
Well, it'll change in some way, but whether you can influence that or not could make a difference.
That's true. But it's just kind of that thing about inertia is such a powerful piece. And so if the inertia is to never do anything besides services, I just don't see prevention efforts or reduction efforts are going to organically be funded. They might grow out of community in a response to the inertia that the systems are, created. And maybe that's not a bad thing. Hadn't really thought about it from that perspective. I came to do sexual assault work by a roundabout way. I had moved up to Washington State right after college, and my first job was at Microsoft. And so one of the things that was happening for me at Microsoft, is all tech bros even then, is I was noticing like this disconnect in being able to do something that was important to me. So I decided to volunteer at Seattle Rape Relief. So I thought, okay, I can do this. Yeah, I do have a family history of sexual assault and DV, and so I kind of came in at it from the way a lot of survivors do, but I had a distinct skill set. I was pretty good at training and facilitation, and so I was never one of the folks that came into the work who leaned heavily on being a survivor, although that was my history. And I think my first job at Seattle Rape Relief was youth education specialist, and then I was training specialist. I did several roles there. And one of the things that Anne McGettigan told me that I never forgot was to pay attention to my funding and what I was actually paid to do, to read the grant that was funding your position. Mm-hmm. And the reason I've never stopped doing that is because it always really helped me understand what the desires were of the folks who are providing the funding. And so I've always tried in the sexual assault work that I was doing to align, and if I couldn't align my personal views with what the funding was for, then I would try to shift roles or shift positions so I didn't have that cognitive dissonance of doing something that wasn't meaningful to me. I think I came early 90s. I know I was technically the last staff person at Seattle Rape Relief when it imploded. And so it had to be, I'd have to look at a resume, maybe a decade? I don't know. The community development projects were actually the state of Washington responding to a CDC grant that was the beginning of the rape prevention and education funding cycle. And what the fundamental question was, basically, it was kind of the Lofquist pieces. It was this piece around what would it take to engage the community in an upstream prevention strategy that would reduce the prevalence of rape. And so in Washington State, and whoever developed the application, I wasn't high enough before that. McGettigan or somebody else might have more information on that. But basically, there was this multi-tiered approach that was developed. And so there was an evaluator who was funded strictly to evaluate all the pieces. There was a competitive process for the community development initiatives. And so individual rape crisis centers applied to be part of this one. And so I know we had Karen Boone was doing Spokane. I had the one that was in King County or Seattle, which is at Washington Middle School. Glenda Tanner had one in Tacoma. There may have been, I feel like Emma was part of that one, but I can't remember whether Safety Center had another one. But there were these initiative projects. And so each one of them had a different hypothesis. And so Washington Middle School was written to say, what would happen if you actually had a person who was a sexual violence prevention person embedded at the school and was part of the school ecosystem, who had an office at the school, and then it had 2 part-time positions associated with it. A parent advocate who was supposed to be a parent of someone in the school. We actually ended up with a grandparent instead of a parent. And then a youth advocate who wasn't a student, but someone who was closer to that age. And we were each supposed to develop programming that addressed kind of sexual violence within the school. So I took the pieces that were more like the teachers and counselors did. And then, the parent advocate, worked with PTA and after school. And then the youth advocate did Students Against Violence Everywhere was their acronym. So SAVE. So they had SAVE groups after school. And our goal was to actually see if by doing these things, we could change the climate at the school. And it ended up that the major focus was less sexual violence per se and more sexual harassment. Because that was what I kind of identified as the most prevalent occurrence within a middle school from 6 to 8. And so we did things like looked at the disciplinary system. We looked at we had like a life skill course. We had a girls empowerment group. So there was various pieces. And then the evaluators were actually trying to evaluate what our impact was. And at the same time, there was also a social media campaign that had some posters and some media ads, the hearts and the jail.
Yeah, what do you call that?
The mugshot.
Mugshot, yeah.
Yeah, and so those were all funded under one piece of work as a demonstration project. Mm-hmm. And I think it was a 3-year demonstration project.
So what was the outcome?
Don't really know. I mean, like I've looked at some of the evaluation reports, because that was also, so rape relief was ending, and so we finished out the project. Anecdotally, what I think the outcome was for my particular project is when there wasn't funding to support the placement of having a professional do the job within the school, that they lost the momentum to do the work. But
the school did?
Yeah. Uh-huh. But when an external person paid for that, like I would evaluate like the disciplinary pieces, and I pointed out like, the kids of color are getting disciplinary action for popping a bra and the white kids aren't. Or we were able to like do all of these pieces and show that we were moving toward changes. Mm-hmm. That said, I did a lot of stuff that probably people wouldn't consider like sexual violence prevention, like hall duty. My day-to-day work was kind of in conjunction with the other counselors and counseling staff, and there was like somebody from Atlantic Street Center, which was the homeless person. There was a family support person doing like drug and alcohol. So we all just kind of acted as a unit. Mm-hmm. figuring that really for those kids, going back to the social determinants of health, it didn't matter if the kid was, if I was talking to a kid and it was mainly around how being homeless was affecting them being bullied, that eventually that would help the climate around sexual harassment, because there's this trusting group of adults that you could, you know, have intervene. And it also gave teachers an in-house person to check some of their biases, because gender stereotypes and norms and what they allowed, and someone like calling out a teacher for not like holding a kid accountable was pretty powerful, because a kid would tell me like, this happened in my classroom and so teacher just said, oh, don't worry about it. And then I, you know, would talk to that teacher and be like, oh, I heard that, you know, so called this person this slur that was gender-based, and you said don't worry about it. Can you help me understand what that's about? And they'd be like, oh, well, I didn't know how to deal with it. I'm like, oh, well, here's how you deal with it. You interrupt it. You're a bystander. You're supposed to do that.
You're so nice and yet direct, and, you know, but you do it with a smile on your face. And
yeah, so it was working, and the reason I say I don't know what the and I stayed in touch with that school for a couple years after, but it wasn't something that the school had resources to pay for basically one FTE to do that. And it wasn't a model that would have been something that Harborview or KSARC, who were the two fiscal agents, were interested in pursuing. Because it is it's a high dosage, and what I mean by like having one FTE that only goes to one school is directing a lot of resources. Where like when I did the teen date rape prevention, I would go to like every high school, middle school health class, you know, and just cycle through and talk to, I don't know, thousands of kids in a year about consent, and so you hit a different number of people.
yeah.
And so those strategies were much more interesting to like large agencies than having like one FTE that just serves a fairly large, you know, middle school. I think it depends on who you ask, but I think basically what happened is we had different sets of funding. There was funding to provide some standard services like the crisis line and all of that. At that point, I was working on a pilot project that was CDC funded. That was the rape prevention and education funds. That was actually cited out of Washington Middle School, so it was kind of a standalone thing. And one of the things that occurred was folks began to have a growing kind of cognitive dissonance with what their funding told them to do and what type of work they thought they really needed to do to make change. We also had co-directors at that time, toward the end, and that was Ellen Hurtado and Ann McGettigan. And I'm not sure of all the pieces that went on kind of behind the scenes, but I do felt that the board was very disempowering of Ellen. And Ellen left, and then Ann left. And once Ann left, there was no one left to hold the space in a kind of a place with integrity. And we had an interim. I can't even remember her name. And I think that was like the beginning of the end.
So I found an article on Seattle Rape Relief's closure, and one of the articles, I mean, I found a few of them, but one of them said that she was a professional, like, closer of agencies.
Yeah, I would believe that. I mean, there was nothing in the way that she moved that held any regard for the mission of Seattle Rape Relief. And I know Pat Vivian had been working with the agency at that time, so she might have some recollection. I know that, you know, it was one of the case studies in her book on organizational psychology where she talks about the shadow side and the strength side. But it really, I think it was truly traumatic for a lot of folks. I was fairly lucky because since the project was all CDC funded and it was self-contained, and I had 2 folks who reported directly to me, when Seattle Rape Relief closed, that particular project continued, and Harborview and KSARC picked us up as fiscal agents. One was kind of fiscal agents on the HR side and paid our salaries, and that was KSARC. And the other side, Harborview gave us office space that was close to Washington Middle School, so if we needed to physically be in like a sexual assault center, we had access to all of those things. And it was actually Bev that helped broker that kind of transition. And so that project, even though Rape Relief closed, I think we may have gone down for the most maybe a month where we weren't actually active. But it was very insightful. And then Cara,
Communities Against
Rape and Abuse, was kind of the folks who were on staff that still really wanted to do kind of that core work of community work around sexual assault were primarily Seattle Rape Relief staff that tried to form an agency that could compete and do those pieces of work. And I think they struggled for quite a long time. The mainstream, the 2 big ones just didn't always make space. And by 2 big ones in the King County, that's Harborview and King County Sexual Assault Resource Center. They're so well resourced that if they're not actively trying to support, the small community-based or community-focused or communities of color, I don't see how they can maintain, because it's almost like they can take all the air out of the room just by showing up.
Yeah.
That's the piece that's really difficult to break. I think executive directors of large agencies, if they really want to further services that are equitable and can reach all populations, they have to believe that culturally specific services have a place, and they have to allow smaller agencies to flourish in that space. And I don't think that always happens, not just locally, but nationally, is they don't quite understand that it's not necessarily a critique of their model. Their model might work really well for providing large-scale services to people who identify as wanting mainstream services. But there are folks who don't want mainstream services, and having alternative ways for people to seek healing and to be with people in community in a different way was part of how rape crisis centers were founded. And I don't know how that got lost as it became a whole service delivery system.
Well, I think it's because it became a whole service delivery system, which takes me to wanting to ask you if you could speak more to that dissonance that you think that you felt the staff had around what they were being funded to do versus what did they think they needed to be doing?
So I think they really wanted to do exactly what the communities asked of them. And so if the community said, well, we don't really, I remember crisis lines do not resonate for a lot of folks of color. They definitely don't resonate at the time in Black communities. I don't know that if it's changed post-COVID and now that everything is so much more aligned, but that was always an issue. But the main funding for rape crisis centers, core funding, is that you run a crisis line. You run support groups, they're these standard services. And so they would want to devote X amount of their time to doing community-based healing strategies that communities had asked for. And none of those were actually deliverables on the grants. And so now they're in opposition with the funders who are like, this is what we're paying you to do. And they're saying, this isn't what community wants. Community wants these things. And so for some funders, what they're going to do is just pull the funding and give it to an agency that does exactly what they've asked to do. What other funders might do is to be in conversation and to say, well, do you have can you prove this is a best practice? Can you talk about how this promotes healing? Can you give me an outcome that I can fund? Can you find, and sometimes, not always, because now I work in a place where I am the government and a lot of what I do is funding. Like there are some places where you can find funding that has fewer restrictions or allows for that flexibility. And there's some funds that you can't. But I do think it's the responsibility of funders to be in conversations with the organizations that they fund and to be honest about what's prescriptive and what isn't. And I also think on the other side, I wasn't in that funding place at the time where I was the decision makers, is I really think it was very, very difficult for a lot of the folks who were at Seattle Rape Relief to understand the system that they were part of. Because they saw the work on the ground, but there's a whole other level of budgets and administrative functions and all of the pieces that until you've actually done it at a 501c3, you may be oblivious to what it takes to actually kind of fulfill the grant requirements. So I think the fact that some of those folks were more early in their career paths and didn't have that kind of grounding knowledge also made it more difficult for them and set up more dissonance, because they were just like, why won't people listen to us? Mm-hmm. I think Seattle Rape Relief actually would have been salvageable with a different type of interim ED that came in at the end. But I'm guessing the board was fatigued. Like I wasn't in those conversations. I don't know what made them make that call to bring that ED in. Because fundamentally, I think Rape Relief was going through a transition that I saw lots of other rape crisis centers that were of that same age go through, is how do you transition from being really grassroots to finding your footing and your place in something that is clearly a delivery system. And I think they could have found their place and still serve communities of color well.
As somebody who has been in conversations with funders, what were the challenges?
The way I did it, which isn't necessarily how everybody did it, is going back to that statement where Anne told me to read the grant. Mm-hmm. I read the grants. I will follow the money up to the source. I read VAWA, I read all the pieces, and so I would say like, hey, we want to do this. And they would say, oh, well, I don't think that's allowed. And I'd say, well, look, I read this paragraph and it says that we can do these 3 things. What do you think about that? So I wouldn't necessarily come in as argumentative, but I used the same guiding documents that they use to make their decisions to make my argument. And that's probably why I ended up working in state government, is because for me, using that particular skill set of understanding the prescribed structure and where you can push and where you can't, and what does it mean to comply with the rules of the grant and what does it mean to be out of compliance. I understood it when funders were speaking to me. That said, I didn't always get the funding results that I wanted, and you do run the risk that if the person on the other end is operating from a place of needing to feel powerful or not to be questioned, there is inherent power in those positions, and they might be vindictive. I think I lucked out to a certain degree, is that the folks who were, at least on the sexual assault side, either who were at OVW at the time or who were at state, were allies. And so they weren't trying to be in opposition with me. They were trying to understand my perspective. I've probably done peer review for OVW for over 20 something years. Whether I've worked in sexual assault or not, I still do it. Because there's kind of a shared goal. And then folks like Stephanie Condon and Bev Emery were at OCVA. Susan Hannibal was at DSHS. They had similar kind of goals and takes. So if I could make a reasonable argument about structuring something in a certain way, they didn't punish me. Now, who would punish me, if I'm being really frank, are peers at other agencies who may not have wanted that to happen.
May not have wanted changes to happen?
Yeah, there are a lot of folks, because I almost always was advocating for more funds toward communities of color, more funds to go for culturally specific models. And there are folks who have kind of a zero-sum argument, and any money I got or any money I diverted to those efforts, they felt was taking away, mainstream sexual assault money. So I wouldn't necessarily say I made a whole lot of friends in in my peers who were either EDs or program managers across the state, because they saw me as shifting the work away from where they thought the work should be. I think a lot of times they felt the work should be for the people who show up at their doors, that they want to be able to provide services to the people who seek them out. And I was like, well, that's great. That's what you want to do. I think we should be providing services to the people who don't even think they're allowed to seek you out.
Making friends all over the place.
Yeah, so I probably have a mixed legacy. There are probably people who appreciate the work that I've done over the years, and people who would have preferred I not show up at a meeting.
Tell me about your time at WICSAT.
I think for me, there's two distinct eras for me at WICSAT. There was an era when Suzanne and Christy and me and Gail were kind of the leadership team. And I'm not saying we're perfect, because we are all flawed individuals in our own ways. And I put myself in that category too. I have distinct flaws. And this may sound ageist, but we were also pretty young. But what we did well, Gail was our moderating force. I think what we did well is we each, in our own kind of sphere, we would push on any barrier. And we really tried to infuse a sense of excellence into the work. Both Gail and I freely pushed around issues of community color or LGBTQ. People often thought that we would get on our high horse, so to speak, and declare ourselves as more deserving or better at doing anti-oppressive work or better at analysis, which, sometimes we were, sometimes we weren't. But I think we had we stated our intention to do the work differently and to improve the system, and we all had a lane in which we operated. At the time, Gail was on the prevention side. I was doing education advocacy, which is basically the care side. Suzanne was the ED, and then Christy was doing kind of the organizational pieces. And I think for the most part, we worked well until toward the end of that. Is for women of color doing sexual assault work nationally or locally, it is a brutal environment. Women of color EDs were turning over, left and right. I think there were maybe like 5 at the time. I don't know if there's ever been even any more than 5 at any given time. But anytime they were pushing for change or movement, they were labeled as troublemakers or labeled as incompetent. And so I was running into a lot of those pieces. Even though I wasn't the ED, I kind of had autonomy in the piece that I had. And so one of the kind of last things that I did, and it was after Suzanne had already left, I think Christy was pretty much getting ready to leave, is there was the continuum of sexual violence. And it had always been this like straight line thing where you go from beginning to end. And it was one sexual assault awareness month or week, I can't remember what we called it back then. And I was really irritated about the whole thing, about it coming from beginning to end. So I decided it was a circle. And then I also decided that it was oppression that was the center of it. And so I revisioned the continuum, and I ran it in, I think, Partners in Social Change as the revised curriculum. There were 2 pieces about the continuum that I wanted to change. One was the fact that just because, like when you lay things out on this straight line, it has a hierarchy of experiences. And for all the women I had talked to over the years, that's meaningful. Like what is really impactful for somebody may be less from somebody else. And so that was why I needed it to be a circle, as I just needed it to show that there were all of these pieces. And then the idea about putting oppression in the middle is, it really feels to me as if we had this singular argument and kind of first wave, second wave feminism, that if you just addressed sexism, that sexual assault was the extreme manifestation of sexism, and if you could do that, then everybody would be safe. And so it has oppression in the middle, but the circles around it call out sexism, racism, anti-Semitism, classism. I forget how many I put around. I put like several isms to really point out, like, fixing sexism, quote unquote, is not going to end sexual assault. That really it's about this interconnectedness between all of these isms, that in order to really, if your goal isn't to provide, because you could have a goal of providing services that promotes healing to survivors. And that is an admirable goal. But that wasn't actually my goal. My goal was to disrupt the systems, our social systems, that make sexual violence so prevalent. And so to do that, you had to talk about the violence that was happening against Indigenous women. You had to talk about all of these pieces that weren't about sex and sexism. They were about homophobia. They were about all of these pieces, and that fundamentally, this whole thing about having power over people, that sexual violence was just one manifestation of how our society supports having power over. And that one of my hypotheses, but I stopped doing the work at that time, was that you could have had a continuum around the outside of something else other than sexual violence. Like, yes, I did sexual violence, but almost any other type of violence you can actually probably tie to those same kind of determinant factors, because once you have those factors in play, then you're going to have somebody who is the perpetrator or the actor, and somebody that it's okay to victimize. And so it was kind of the beginning of me understanding, what did sexual assault work have to do with the larger kind of equity argument? And post that time, most of my work, and I've now worked doing HIV work, I'm now doing some work with community health workers, has really been less about the individual manifestation of the inequity. Like I could do work with youth violence. It's less about the type of violence and really trying to figure out what are the strategies from a state level, because that's where I am now, that can help us disrupt those societal systems, or, because I think there are a lot of people who are working really pretty well at providing services to us when those things impact us negatively. I think there are less people who have interest in trying to do more of the upstream preventative type work, and that's kind of the nexus where I think I'm better at working. I think I have the temperament to do that, but I also have more interest in being at that place than I do at the actual point of service. But I kind of want to make sure that I've always tried to make sure that people understand, like, I value the services. When I've needed the services, like having somebody accompanying me, or having the correct support groups, having someone to do those individual advocacy pieces, have been integral to my healing process. But I don't have the temperament to do those well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One
One of the things that I was afraid of, because I noticed that kind of there was a sea change at WICSAP, like a change in the weather.
Oh, uh-huh.
So I was afraid that it was possible that someone would change my intent if I left, and I was considering leaving at that time. So I asked Christy to designate that as one piece of work that I held intellectual property over, that they couldn't change it without asking my permission. And so for a lot of years, you would see WICSAP and Lydia Guy. And that wasn't because I was trying to get I never got any money for it in a copyright. It was about, I wasn't sure that the people who were left actually understood why I did what I did. And I wanted that if they changed it significantly enough to make it feel hollow or to subvert my meaning, I wanted to be able to pull my name off of it, and so that it was clear that that wasn't what I thought. And so it was kind of a symbolic piece.
Yeah. As you were talking about the spiral of isms with oppression in the middle and equity, it just, like, I started having this vision of, have you been on stage where there's like lights, for a performance? So I was imagining that each of those circles was a light, and that each one that you get impacted on turns on, and turns on, and turns on, and it just gets hotter and hotter, and it's like, this is what the inequity is.
Yep.
Is the light that shines on you is different than the light that shines on me, is different, because of all of these inequities.
Yeah, it's that intersectional approach. And if you think about it, if we could design systems that work for folks who have the most light shining on them, they'll work for the rest of us. Because the rest of us have less intensity. And so, but we don't tend to do that as systems. We tend to design them for wherever the bulk of people are. And there is a cost effectiveness to that. And so I don't think we should stop doing that, but I think you need to do that, and you have to take certain amount of your resources and try to focus on folks. I don't always like to use the word marginalized, but for this, it works for folks who are experiencing the most marginalization. Because you get, that way you get better, hopefully. That, how you do this circle that's mainstream will be informed by all of these things you're testing out with the people that are experiencing a greater amount of distress because of the, the factors on them. In public health, we say the social determinants of health. Like poverty is crushing. Like if you look at the resources that someone has when they are experiencing sexual violence, and they have money, and the resources that you do not have, if you don't have money, if you don't have a home, like trying to find a safe place to heal and to like soothe your soul when you can't even find a place that houses your body in a safe way, how can you soothe your mind? And so developing services just for people who have a home to go to and a telephone to call you from and are relatively safe in that environment is not going to fundamentally impact the person who doesn't have any of those things.
Tell me what led to the other demonstration projects, the ones that you initiated through WICSAP.
So that one came out of another meeting, as I had a small amount of money. I think it was like, I don't know, 20 grand or something. And I had been having a conversation with somebody, and they said, oh, you can't really create change with a small amount of money. And they said, your demonstration projects, they only worked because you had lots of money. And I said, well, yeah, we did have lots of money. We had lots of resources. But I'm not sure that it's about the money. I think it's more than that. So I had an hypothesis, like, let's see what happens if I use this small amount of money that I think I was supposed to take that money and do like a community development initiative out, within WICSAP itself, was how it was written in the grant. So I asked the funder, which is OCV, I can't remember whether it's OCV or DOH at the time, like, what if I do it this way? I said, there are 3 communities who we've been talking to through Community Voice, I can't remember which meetings, that have really pointed out that there are things that are very specific about their community that aren't working. And so one was, there was gay men that were, I was good at, on the border of Washington and Idaho, Clarkston, Lewiston, I forget. And they were experiencing sexual violence, and part of what they talked about was the fact that there were no safe places to meet. And so the homophobia was so oppressive that people were putting themselves into like unsafe circumstances because they didn't have any other options to try to find community. And they wanted to unpack that within their community. There was one that was sex workers who had experienced sexual violence. And there was the whole kind of debate around whether sex work was liberating or was by definition oppressive, and how it impacted them. And it was all Native women. And they wanted to focus on that. And then there was homeless youth in Thurston County who were experiencing high rates of like homelessness and sexual violence that seemed to be correlated to the fact that they didn't have safe places to be. So I took each of those areas, found somebody who was within those communities or close to those communities or part of them to champion those efforts, and tried to provide like the tools, like the community development, like the Lofquist stuff, but tried to let them do whatever they thought was logical, and then provide some support. And Pipe was the only one that really had long-term longevity in being able to become a 501c3. So it's like a 300 batting average, which I thought was actually, decent using that piece. That was my argument. What happened with the gay men that were in rural Washington, what they had determined was that they didn't really need sexual assault services. What they really wanted was a community center. And for the life of me, I could not figure out how to find funding that would support them to develop a 501c3 LGBTQ center. Because none of the funding at my capacity would do that. So that community came up with something that would have provided an adequate fix for what they needed, but we couldn't fund it. And so it eventually died. The Native women that were leaving the sex industry or in the sex industry, they started to meet, and they figured out that they had so much unresolved trauma that they didn't want to do prevention work. They actually just wanted a support group to unpack that. So I switched that to advocacy education funding and gave Arlene Red Elk money to run a support group.
Oh, okay. All right.
And so it was successful in that that's what they wanted, but I couldn't keep it on the prevention side because they weren't trying to change anything. They were trying to provide services to this group of women that were in pain, and it just became part of the normal services pot of money that was going out.
And is that what turned into Mother Nation?
I think so, eventually. So when I looked at those, I was like, so when I look at them retrospectively, I'm like, a small amount of money did do good when it was placed in the hands of community with the funder. In that case, it was, money running through WICSAP, but I still looked at WICSAP as funder taking a minimal support role. And where it didn't, immediately turn into what we expected it to be, like Pipe kind of had like the expected trajectory for success. The other two didn't have like what wouldn't necessarily be deemed successful in like that 5-year pilot kind of piece. But I believe that it talks about the power of micro grants or small grants when used appropriately. But you can't only give people micro grants.
So it was, you think, $20,000 for all that covered all three?
Oh yeah, it was a small amount of money. And so as each when Pipe could do things, like if I use Pipe for example, then I could say like, oh, they've used their seed money for this. Let me connect them with this pot of money that we are already paying other types of people to do this. So then it wasn't specifically money. It wasn't the seed money. It was connecting them to what I would call categorical funding, like funding that they never, that this group of people would have never had the infrastructure to apply for. So it was no longer WICSAT money. It's like, oh, they're going to get that money from OCVA like the rest of the people.
So that whole 5-year trajectory and pipe following that path to success was really based, for me, it was based on a comment from one community leader, long-haired Dave, who, he started Iggy Hop, and I think he was one of the founders of the Needle Exchange in Thurston County. Anyway, Iggy Hop distributes food or whatever resources they can get their hands on. They go on bikes up and down and distribute whatever they can to the folks out on the streets. And one day I met with him as a key stakeholder, to like ask, well, who should I talk to and where should I go? And he was like, you're like the college kids, you're gonna study the community and then you're gonna disappear. And I was like, I'll show you. It was little moments like that influence the trajectory.
Yeah, and I think that's how community works. It's kind of serendipitous. It's, the other thing that I've never been able to kind of like put my finger on is it's very much about having the right organizer or the right staff with the right group of people at the right moment of time. And I think if you don't hit all those things in the right way, you don't get the movement you would expect. And you can't force it.
Yeah. How do you develop that, do you think?
I don't know. I think part of it is luck. I mean, honestly, I think it's partially luck, and I think it's also choosing somebody who resonates for the community and whether it would be your first choice or not. Mm-hmm. So I think the funder or whoever's in that prescribed structure place has to bend more to accept the person that is embraced by community or that community puts forth. Mm-hmm. But other, there have been other times that I've seen, like, you think it's going to work, you think you have everything lined up and the synergy there, but it turns out that maybe the community leader just doesn't have the skill. The community organizing skill, or maybe the community leader that's there, unbeknownst to you, is actually doing something that they shouldn't be, or doing something that's harming some other segment of people, because communities is typically very protective of like airing dirty laundry to external folks. And sometimes as a funder, you'll think that this is like the right person, and you'll turn out that they were bullying people in order to be perceived as the right person. I mean, I didn't have that happen in those, but in the years that I've watched different ones thrive and some like falter, is sometimes it's just been like, I just didn't read the person right. And community didn't feel safe enough to say like, we never really trusted them, but that's who you gave us.
We're seeing that sexual assault is like continues to rise. There's just more and more and more and more and more and more and more. Mm-hmm. So how could we possibly justify taking resources away from direct services to do social change work?
I mean, I think it's an interesting question, because what I would actually ask is, yes, we're seeing it, you may be seeing it rise, or you're seeing it rise over what period of time, but also, are you looking at it in context of what's going on in the world in and of itself? Like, is the prevention work that one is doing, is it throttling it to a certain degree? Because the amount of like just violence and bad behavior and that I see currently in the world is phenomenal. Like violence is an accepted strategy. So I think the question becomes, is if there was no push against violence, how much violence would we have now? I mean, that's a really hard thing about prevention data. Is prevention data is one of the hardest things to measure, because you're trying to figure out, what did this thing do that might have prevented it from being worse? And so I do think it's valid, but I do think that that's a question that isn't, I'm going to say it the right way. Like, just because you see a rise in sexual violence and it's continued to go up, doesn't mean the prevention strategies did not have some ameliorating effect. Because we've seen all types of violence go up. Like, personally, I don't think I've ever been in, and I'm almost 60 years old, in an era where it is so accepted to literally talk about harming someone. Like, that's just normative. And so it makes sense to me that sexual violence would go up if all types of violence goes up. So I'd send it back to an epi and go, okay, can you tell me, can you break that down? Can you help me understand what is the violence that's going on in the world? When we started this, was it the same amount? Or were you just looking at sexual violence in a vacuum? What are some of the other factors that may be impacting, to see if you can get a true answer? And maybe they're right. If it's not producing any measurable effect, you would want to invest more in services as opposed to shifting more to prevention. But I actually haven't seen any analysis, especially in sexual assault, that's ever been done with complete data. Like, we don't know really what's going on, because we don't have any data set in which you ask every person their experiences. We have telephone surveys, we have surveys of people who are receiving services, we have anecdotal information. But finding out people's actual experiences around sexual violence has always been an extremely hard thing to research that hasn't had very much funding focused on it, for the same reasons as we don't want to take funding away from direct services to kind of investigating, prevalence and incidence.
Do you see the level of violence that we see in the world today at all tied to the civil rights movement and the feminist movement and the professionalization of this work as like a backlash to those collective movements?
I don't know if it's a backlash or it's cyclical, but I do feel like it is in response. I feel as if, and this isn't more, and when I use the word like feel or believe, it's one of the ways in which I'm saying I don't have data to back this up, but it's my perception that as certain movements have pushed issues of civility and equity and fairness and giving voice to pieces, that those things have threatened folks who prefer to operate from a power over, and that in their desire to maintain that power, they've actually escalated and responded with more force as opposed to backing down and using less force. I don't know what the folks who have always kind of been on the middle, because I think that's where the most interesting place lies. It's like you have people who are clearly okay with using force for all this our power over. You have people who are clearly against it. But there's this whole middle ground of people who can sway to any way. And I think most of our strategies probably should be more focused on those people in that middle area, because that's what will fundamentally make the difference. Because when they go with the folks who are all about power over, it creates a social structure that supports being abusive, supports the lack of social safety nets, supports all those pieces. When these people swing with folks who believe more in egalitarian and sharing resources, it creates a social service system or social constructs which will care for those who are unable to care for themselves. Lately, I've been thinking. I just read the book Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, and part of it I've been thinking about is like, is the United States like really just? Do we have really strong caste systems? And one of our things is we really just been trying to like focus on what's defined as the lower caste and who's defined as being the upper caste, and people are trying to move within the caste versus trying to actually eliminate a caste system where we have people with significantly more resources and access to things than others.
I recognize that we didn't do a good job of like taking pictures of the community voices meetings, and I know we had notes.
I don't know who would possibly have them.
Well, I'm betting that because of the way Gail worked, that Gail probably had them, and so they're lost to, because I think she was really protective of, that information not being like misconstrued or changed. So I'm betting that like she had the notes, took the notes, used the notes to make the reports or to do whatever, and that they may have at one time existed at WICSAP, but all the stuff that was of any use at WICSAP was destroyed by the folks who came after us because they didn't see it as, I don't mean like destroyed maliciously, but they didn't have any
use for it.
Yeah, it's like Andrea and Ellen, like they wouldn't have had any sense of like reverence over, voices of people of color or the, remembrances of, it was just an initiative to them.
What was it to you?
I felt like it was kind of, initially it was a point of resistance. I remember we were in a meeting, one of those, when they were trying to set up accreditation. So I can't remember what year this was. And so it would have been like Ann McGettigan and me and Gail, and I think I was still at, Seattle Rape Relief. And folks kept talking about like, who are you talking about when you say these communities that aren't heard? I don't know who you're talking about. We don't know who these people are. And like somebody, I think it was probably Gail, talked about like, well, they're whole communities whose voices you don't hear, that aren't, registering for you. And that's why to me it was more of an initiative. It was really like this piece of trying to get the mainstream providers to be like their voices, just like you talk about like centering women's voices and their voices that for whatever reason you don't hear. So if you can't hear them, you can't even begin to make a delivery system that works for folks.
Mm-hmm.
And the vast amount of money at that time was going to like the top 5 centers. It wasn't even going so much to rural folks. It would have been like KSARC was pulling a lot of money. Harborview at that time wasn't like the Center for Trauma. I think it was Harborview Sexual Assault Center was the official name. Seattle Rape Relief was pulling money. I think somebody in Spokane was probably like the fourth. And I think Debbie Ruggles may have been in Yakima. That may have been the other one, that was pulling people. And then all the other counties were either too small, so they didn't really have a lot of infrastructure to support sexual assault specifically. They may have had DV programs, but they weren't really. And so that was part of, accreditation is different than Community Voices, but that was really another part of what accreditation was supposed to do, is to like solidify folks being able to do sexual assault services and to even the playing field for some of the smaller rural folks. And then once they came in with accreditation, then it's like, well, you still don't hear people of color. You now have, I don't know how many sexual assault centers there are anymore, but you have the big ones, and you probably have like 30 rural ones. And I would guess there still is not significant uptake except in a handful of them in communities of color.
Mm-hmm.
There's some things you just have to say, like you just have to make plain, like you have to make yourself known, if that makes any sense. And for me, Community Voices was a group of people, or in that case, we were service providers who were working with a group of people who just really got tired of hearing like, we don't exist, we don't see you, they don't show up at our doors, we don't have any people like that in our community. And I was like, what? We're all invisible? Like, it was really just kind of like a statement, like, whether you serve us or not, we exist. So stop saying that we don't exist. Whether you serve us or not, we have opinions about what services are helpful. You can choose to listen or not, but stop saying that we don't exist. Like, I don't know that I expected it to go any further initially than just proving to people like, we do exist, we are here.
One of the things, when I talked to Nancy, one of the things that she shared, that Gail had shared with her, was that when Community Voices, when the report was released, that there were several quotes in it, and that there was a lot of disbelief that those were real quotes.
Yeah, I got into an argument at an OCVA meeting. I can't remember who it was, but somebody said something to the effect of, where are these quotes from? Who are these shadowy people who are saying these quotes? And Christy was across from me, and I leaned back, because I remember, it's one of the, you have moments in meetings where you remember. And there was this white woman, and I said, could you repeat that, please? And she said, who is this shadowy people who are giving? And I go, I said, who are these shadowy people? Can you help me understand your choice of word? Am I a shadow? Is there a color reference? And the whole room just was like completely silent, and she turned, her whole body was red, not just her face. And she was like, I just meant we don't know who they are. I'm like, and then I think my last statement to her was something like, oh, I think I know what you meant, but I understand your words. And it kind of ruined that meeting. I mean, like the meeting, like when you have a meeting that's chill, like not chill like cool, but chill like everybody's afraid to speak. Because I was sitting over there with my arms crossed like that, and Christy was across from me, because we had done like a road show where we went around, to share, and like people are like, no, we're not saying anything in front of Lydia today. Like we're just not saying anything in front of her. I just saw what happened. And So I think we just sat there for a little while, and then, yeah. I think after we may have even ended early. I remember like getting up and walking out, and I like slammed the door behind me. I didn't quite throw a fit, but it was pretty close to throwing a fit, because it was completely coded language. And none of her peers called her on it. None of the other, I mean, quite frankly, none of the white people, well, nobody called her on it. But to me, that was like, if you all are allies, when she started talking about shadowy women in the report, you should have come and got her before I had to go get her. And so I think that's the other reason was it was chill. So people knew that I was angry with her, but I was also angry with each and every one of them who did not interrupt. And she was an ED, because it was one of those who did not interrupt their peer. Because I was WICSAP staff at that point in time, so we weren't supposed to, we weren't the audience. We weren't supposed to talk. We're the facilitating. We're supposed to let them, talk amongst themselves. OCVAs presenting Gail's. So Gail's in the role of like, presenting, and OCVA staff is in the role of funder. In WICSAP, we're there as the technical assistance providers. We're not actively.
Yeah, well, it sounds like you provided some technical assistance that day.
Yeah, that's what, there are not a lot of meetings, because I've been in a lot of contentious meetings, but that one I will always remember, because it was just so obvious. And we were kind of sitting across from me. I was almost directly across from her. So it was easy for me to maintain eye contact with her, and to just kind of watch the piece unfold. But it happened it happened so much that I think that, if I remember correctly, Bev had to like have a whole little spiel about who the people were in the report, that they were real, and that, X amount of people were interviewed, and blah, 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 blah.
So she had a role to validate the information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that Gail hadn't like manufactured it and made up these people and made up these quotes, because how could they possibly be true?
Do you know where Bev is now?
Bev passed away.
Oh, she did.
Yeah.
Well, everybody that I've talked to has good things to say about her and what an ally she was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she wasn't always the softest. well, I remember being afraid of her when I first met her. But she was a good ally. She just wasn't like as much as Gail was like earth mother and warm and fuzzy, you didn't get any of that from Beth.
So what are other examples of what allyship looked like or could look like?
I think it really depends on your role, but to me...
Well, let's say somebody at the state.
Okay. I think often if we're at the state, we have less to lose than our community partners saying the same piece. So I think if I'm being an ally and I'm in my state role, it is for me to call that out, and then to ask, like, oh, is there anybody, from community who wants to further add information, so that I'm taking the brunt of the initial piece, but then I also need to be a true ally. I have to have it not be my voice. I actually have to shift it from my voice to community voice. And so that ally piece is almost like, I want to say, taking the initial hit. Mm-hmm. You can be an ally by providing the backup data, kind of like adding validity to something that has been said. You can be an ally. There are many times that I've been in groups working for the state and otherwise when we're making funding decisions, particularly when we're talking around people of color, and I've been the only person of color in the room. And they're talking about like, oh, it's hard to reach populations, and how do we? And so I can't count the number of times. But even though I am a person of color, in that room I'm actually being an ally. And in that room, what I typically say is like, you do know that I'm the only person of color here, and I'm not actually part of the community. I'm part of you all. And we're making decisions for a whole bunch of community people who have different experiences than me, and they have no access to this room. And I barely have access to this room. And, you know, people are usually like, what do you mean? I'm like, look, there's like 20 of us here. There's 15 of us here. And I'm the only, visible person of color. Because I don't want to assume that there's not somebody else who identifies as a person of color. So I think those are ways that you can be an ally, and you could do the same around LGBTQ issues. Or like if there doesn't appear to be any immigrants, that you owe it to point out to the system that they are making decisions without substantive input from those populations. And so you can't always change it, but you need to go on the record so that when communities say like, this isn't what I needed, the system who made that decision can't fall back on, well, nobody told us that it might not be what you needed. It's like, no, somebody told you that they're not here, so they might not want this. And a lot of times you will not have the power to move the system as an ally, but you do have the power to raise the question in a much safer environment. And so I think fundamentally, it's a power sharing, because I also have experienced personally people who tell me that they're being my ally, but it feels disempowering, because then they go on to speak for me and so it's a nudge and a move. It's like you push the door open and then you move out the way. You don't to me. It's not about you receiving the credit. Like, you're almost a better ally if people never know what you did, as opposed to praising you, up and down for all the times you fought all the battles. Because then when you fight all the battles, you're still demonstrating that the person in that power position is who's powerful enough to fight the battles. If you want the power shift, you actually have to let whoever you were the ally to come into their full power, and you stand either to the side or ideally you stand right behind them. Using that metaphor, if you can't, I'm like kind of that thing of like, I'm right behind you. If they make it through you, I will back you up. And we need to learn, I think state government and federal government, but I haven't worked in federal government, we need to learn more about how it's not as important to always be out in front. It is important to be that line of defense right behind community.
As you're talking, I think about like Partners in Prevention and how it was able to access buy-in for funding. We will stand in this position as an organization to hold this space, but everything that we do, we're checking with the community. We're saying, okay, this is what the last group said last week when we talked about this, and what do you guys think about that, and how would you tweak it, or how would you make it better, or what's not working, and that it was always about centering the voices of the community in our action, as opposed to, oh, that's a great idea, thanks. Hey, I got this great idea, right? But instead it was always, this is what the community is saying. I'm just bringing it to the table because you let me in.
Yeah, and I think that's a different role then we're taught to use positional power. Like often I think, if you come to work, like if you become an ED, if you become a, work in government, which by definition it has some power, we're often told that the way you move through those circles is by exerting power in that kind of hierarchical way. And I don't necessarily, there are times that you do need to do that in that role. But I think it's rarer than people assume that you need to do it. Toward the end, I can't remember her last name. Evelyn and I were we were co-directors at WICSAP, and she was an MBA. And I remember she sat with me one day and she said, like, I'm not so sure what you bring to the table, and so I think I should be executive director and you should just go back to doing your prevention, because at that time it was prevention services because Gail had left. And
meanwhile you're doing national work.
Yep, I'm doing national work, doing all of that. She just didn't see the value in that piece. And I was also pregnant. And I was at that time, when it got really bad toward the end, I was pregnant. I was on leave because I had a placenta previa, so I needed to be on bed rest until 38 weeks. And Evelyn called me up and she said, well, when you come back from maternity leave, I don't think this is working with you and I to be co-directors. I think one of us, was the way she said it, needs to be the executive director, and one of us needs, because I can't keep fighting with you about the direction. And I was like, okay, then let me think about this. And I hung up the phone. And I thought about the fact that I was a Black woman with a history of cancer who was pregnant. I thought about all the maternal outcomes. And I thought, this woman waited till I got to 38 weeks, which is, the time when it's viable, when it's, not as dangerous to call me and tell me that that this wasn't working. And I realized at that point that there was no understanding of equity or disparities, or even simple human understanding of seeing me as a whole woman. And so I called her back and I said, I think I'll leave. You do you. And so I never went back to WICSAP at that point. One of the things that was happening at that time was I'd been working on a project for the Department of Health, Synergies. It was kind of like a Community Voices offshoot project to do the sexual violence prevention plan. And so WICSAP was supposed to finish that work, and then after I was gone, they figured out that they didn't have anybody to do that piece of work. And so Evelyn called me up and asked me whether I would do that piece of work. I was like, maybe, okay. When she sent me the offer, she was offering to pay me 60% of what she had paid other contractors. And I knew that because I had been
reading the contracts.
And, I was aware of what the going rate was. And so I declined, but I also called OCVA, and I called Debbie Ruggles, who was a DOH, and I said, look, I don't actually mind doing this piece of work. But WICSAP has offered to pay me 60% of what the going rate is because they feel that that's what I'm worth. And I said, I can't do that to myself. And so the way it ended up was DOH issued a sole source contract to me as an individual, and I finished up that piece of work. And that was probably the last it was the last sexual assault specific work I did in Washington State. I did do consulting for a while after that, but I made sure to not work within Washington State if I was doing sexual assault, or to cross over into DV, because I didn't want to be in competition or proximity with whatever it was that WICSAP had become. And so it had been a really great place for me to start the work. And at the end, it is probably the single most painful professional experience I have ever experienced. Something about the leadership shifted, and I don't want to, I don't know exactly what it is, but, and I will speak in an I statement, is it felt very much like they wanted to be perceived as an advocate for equity and a place that was doing community-specific work, and that it was fundamentally not that. And so it just churned through and chewed up various people of color in a really harmful way, I believe.
But you talked earlier about how, like, Suzanne and Christy and you and Gail, you all had like some kind of meeting of the mind in terms of how you're going to approach this work, and you all had your areas where you pushed for change. And so to me, when you describe that, and then you describe the situation as with co-directorship with Evelyn, what I hear is flexibility, a level of self-assurance or confidence, and then on the other hand, some rigidity and ego and hierarchy of.
Yeah, I think that's a fair observation, because I think sometimes it's easier to see things from the outside. I think that the leadership that was post, and of course I'm going to speak more kindly of the leadership structure in which I was mainly centered, because we were doing it the way, and I'm not saying, we had some interesting arguments at times, and we made some mistakes, and some things we got right, but it never felt as if one person was using someone else, and it never felt as if the whole goal was power over. And perhaps what went wrong was the leadership structure that was in place as I was exiting felt like everything was about power over, and everything was about using. And everything to me was also about some performative aspect without actually having a personal commitment to the stated goals that you had. Like, I just don't see how you can be in a feminist quote unquote organization and call somebody up at 38 weeks pregnant and do that. Like what is your understanding of what is humane, or and I know that Evelyn never really understood, because we would see each other like at national meetings, and I remember once I had Gabe, who was the child that I was pregnant with, on my back and like an ergo, so he had to be like less than 2, and Evelyn came up and she was playing with his leg, like touching it, and I turned to her and I said, "Please don't touch my child. I do not consent to you touching my child, particularly while I'm wearing him on my body." And she literally seemed shocked. And I was like, you work it is sexual assault. Like, what don't you understand about consent and bodily autonomy? And if we're talking about, race and power dynamics, what makes you think, given how I left, that you were going to come and touch my child? A child that apparently you didn't care whether he lived or I lived. Because you wouldn't have added that additional stress, although I made it to 38 weeks, by initiating that conversation at that point in time. And so I don't think she had any ill intent, but I think she was totally clueless about her actions. And we would have series of actions like that over several years, in which she would engage me in conversation and then be completely surprised when I was like, no, we're not friends. We're not colleagues. Yeah, and I don't know why you think we would be.
Just oblivion, huh?
Yeah, and maybe that's how privilege works in some ways. So maybe for her, like kind of in that MBA kind of world, it was a negotiation and she used what she had to do what she thought was good for the agency, and it turned out all right because I got the contract anyway, and I was still employed, and no ill came to me. And there were other things that quite frankly for me made it really profound, because I was also a cancer survivor, and so part of why I kept jobs was this was pre-ACA, is I didn't want to have a lapse of being uninsured because I wasn't sure if I could get insurance again. And so it felt really like an actual threat, not just an existential threat to my life, and being like, oh no, when you come back, we need to do something differently. And I admit that's my internal bias, and maybe she didn't track any of those things. But WICSAP spent a lot of time talking about disability work and working with people of color and feminist theory. And if you're tracking any of those things, you would know that those are all the layers that went into that conversation. And I think for a long time, WICSAP was able to get people of color to come work there because it was going off the legacy of the work that Gail did, or I tried to further, or other folks like you did at WICSAP. Like, people were like, oh, they did this cool stuff. We think we're going to be able to do that cool stuff. And then they got there and they were like, we can't do that. And then it was shocking to them how little they could actually, live into those ideals, even though they were all at that time still over all the materials and the website. And I think that is actually more harmful than not having it stated that that's what you're doing.
Is there anything that you would like to just say to folks in the field?
I guess for me, I have a certain amount of sadness that I don't think the folks in the field recognize that there were a whole group of people who were really active as part of Community Voices. Whether that was Rhonda Brown or Glinda or Emma or Karen Boone. I mean, there were other people too. And that I feel as if when things kind of stalled or moved backwards or whatever it was that's happened, that there's been the tendency to not honor the work and not honor the women, they're primarily women, that did that work. And I guess it's important to me that, to honor them, like whether or not the work achieved what it was hoped to be achieved, whether or not it needs to be redone now, whether or not it was even the right work. Because hindsight is 2020. You had a group of folks who were actively engaged in trying to move forward kind of the agenda of people of color primarily in kind of sexual assault services. Whether that's the folks who started CARA, there are any number of these pieces that we just kind of, left behind. And I think it does them a disservice. And I also think there are probably things that you could learn from them, even if you learn, like, I'm just not going to do that thing that they did. But there's some things that, by definition, we did that were right. I mean, I look at also people who left the field, because you have Hae Kyung, who's at, I want to say Seattle U, is the head of the social work department. You have Denise Sharifi, who was at Seattle Rape Relief for a long time. I think Ann Torres is a principal somewhere. Ellie is an artist, and Elisa is, I know she was doing keynotes, and Theron's a professor. There are a lot of folks who did a lot of work, and they weren't expecting to be acknowledged for it, and they may do very different work now. But I think recognizing them is important. And I'm sorry that I'm sorry that their story, that we didn't document those stories well enough while I was actively doing the work. It didn't occur to me that the historian aspect would be important. I was more focused on whatever we were just doing. So I do own there's a part in the fact that the reason they've forgotten is there wasn't an attentiveness to creating a historical record. But it never occurred to me that we wouldn't know who those people are.